Welcome to the Atlantic Current. I'm Vince Martin here as always with Tull from the Irish Politics newsletter. Our topic today is Mercosur, a 25-year adventure trying to get a major deal done between major South American countries and the EU. Got so close to the finish line. So we're going to talk today about what happened, use that to launch a broader discussion of sentiment towards trade, both in Europe and here in the United States. But Tull, let's start with this deal. What's the 30-second rundown? What happened? Where do we go from here?
The deal was once dubbed cows for cars. It's showing off South America's agricultural might against Europe's industrial might, I suppose, for want of a better analogy. It took 25 years. It was a stop-start thing for a quarter of a century. The presidents of the European Commission, the European Council, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, Brazil, they attended a ceremony in Asunción last week, and they've agreed basically to eliminate 90% of tariffs between the two blocs. So
right.
It has to be ratified. Its current status is that it's been sent to the European Court of Justice to see if it's actually legal. So that was a very tight vote in the European Parliament. It was 334 votes to 314 votes, I think. It's going to hold the deal up, but it can be ratified or it can be implemented in the meantime while it makes its way through the very slow courts of justice.
Now, this vote to advance it to the court, was that a vote to move it forward or a vote to slow it down?
That was a vote to slow it down and see if it was legal, because the European Union MEPs came under a huge amount of pressure to block this. Ireland voted against it, Poland voted against it, France voted against it. It was heavily lobbied against by the agricultural industry across the EU. Germany have been very strong promoters of this deal because, as I said earlier, it was a cows for cars deal.
Right. Is it a fair, if probably imperfect shorthand, to say that the more industrial a country is, the more likely that country was to support this deal?
Not necessarily, because obviously Ireland's a highly industrialised country and we pretty much, most of our MEPs voted against it, you know.
I got you. Okay.
Fianna Fáil came out against it, Fine Gael came out against it, and they had no other choice. It was a political decision because the independents were going to pull the plug on the government. They didn't support the motion for voting against it. So, as it stands at the moment, it'll take, between 18 and 24 months to get over the line and get out of the European Court of Justice. But it can start being implemented from March on a phased basis.
Well, after 25 years, what's another 18, 24 months? It's not really that big a deal. Why is this taking 25 years? Is one side or the other more responsible for the foot dragging here, so to speak?
The short answer is that for a long time, South America has been in a state of upheaval, numerous coups in different countries, political inertia, and again, they have their own industries they want to protect also. So it's not a case of the EU holding things up because, they're worried about, agriculture produce. It's a case of Brazil, Argentina, these other big, massive economies as well, worried about their own economies and how that'll affect them.
That makes sense because we've obviously had quite a few significant trade deals here over the last, 3 or 4 decades. And most of them, haven't taken 25 years, but they do take a long time for various interests to be satisfied and for politicians to be confident that the deal as a whole is actually an improvement. So that's not terribly
NAFTA,
surprising. Yes. NAFTA is one of the big ones that was passed in 1994, the North American Free Trade Agreement. It was renamed the USMCA, US-Mexico Canada Agreement, in Trump's first term, 2019. That was one. The WTO, of course, World Trade Organization was a big deal here. Most notably, I think it took the U.S. 15 years to agree on whether to vote to admit China into the WTO, which finally happened in 1999. Obviously, in Trump's first term and obviously in the second term, the issue of tariffs and trade has been really jumped forward. So we're quite familiar with these battles over trade and how long they can last and how ardent people can be in defending their interests.
So Mercosur essentially means Southern Common Market in Spanish and Portuguese. And Mercosur was set up in 1991 to promote economic integration, free trade and cooperation amongst its members, similar to the EU, but not as legally tight or as unified. I think Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay and Uruguay, later Bolivia joined. Venezuela was once a member also, but it was kicked out for engaging in some very poor behaviour with human rights.
That's all fixed now.
Yeah, it is. Trump is in there. Trump is bringing human rights and democracy to Venezuela. Mexico and New Zealand have observer status, and I'm guessing they want part of the action there. Mexico, though, is part of the North American free trade, what you're calling it.
Right. USMCA. Yeah. And for European listeners, if you're wondering what the difference between USCMA and NAFTA is, essentially the difference is that they changed the name so that they could tell Trump it was a different deal. Because he campaigned on the idea that NAFTA was, quote, the worst deal ever. And then when he signed USMCA, he said it was the best deal ever. And you can Google this. They're just articles at the time. What the changes were. There's like 6 changes. So in a trade deal that covers, as all these do, 5,000 different categories.
Not the first presidential candidate who's campaigned against free trade agreements. Ross Perot did, didn't he?
During the 1992 election, before NAFTA was finally signed, it was a huge campaign issue. I mean, I one of the biggest of that campaign. And yeah, the famous line from Ross Perot, who was a billionaire businessman who ran as a third-party candidate, he said that if it was passed, you would hear, quote, a giant sucking sound of jobs flooding from the United States to Mexico. George H.W. Bush, to show you how much Republicans have changed, he was really pushing it, and it was actually Ronald Reagan's idea in the first place. Clinton did what, if you're familiar with 1990s American politics, Clinton had a reputation as, quote, a flip-flopper was the label they gave him, that he would always, take one side, then he'd go the other to try and play the center. And he did that here. He literally took months to figure out if he was going to endorse it. Finally, towards the end of the campaign, he said he would endorse it, but he wanted to make changes. That's actually wound up kind of what happened. George H.W. Bush signed it before he came out of office. Clinton made some tweaks, and it was passed in 1994. Whether Perot was right, I think, is very much a matter of debate. You can find people who say that it was an absolute disaster and it destroyed the American manufacturing base. And you can find other people who argue, actually, the direct effect of NAFTA was pretty small. It was automation and other trends. So you can find a study that says, we lost 1 million jobs over 20 years. And you can find another study that says we lost 1 million jobs every year for 20 years. This stuff is complicated.
Look, ultimately, free trade is good for the most part anyway. The EU-Mercosur trade deal is going to link roughly 750 million people, and it's close to a quarter of the world's global GDP. The agreement is expected to remove about 4 billion in tariffs annually and will be the EU's biggest trade deal by the volume of tariff cuts once fully in force. The EU exports somewhere in the region of 57 billion worth of goods to the South American bloc and about 29 billion in service exports. It's going to make the EU the biggest foreign investor in South America if everything going according to plan.
Yeah, let's not tell Trump that. That sounds like it might violate this new Donroe doctrine.
Yes, and I see Trump is threatening to implement 100% tariffs on Canada if it seals a trade deal with China. So trade wars are not over yet.
Does the American trade war, is that affecting this debate in Europe? Is it affecting sentiment towards this deal, whether that's kind of among the public or within individual members of the EU Parliament?
Well, the general thinking amongst diplomats and powers that be is that with the United States being such an unstable trading partner at the moment, we're better off having other markets to invest in,
right,
and vice versa.
Absolutely.
So
now that does make sense. Do you think this is a case? I mean, like you talked about Trump threatening Canada with tariffs after the trade deal. Part of that may have been that as we discussed last episode, Mark Carney took implicit aim at Trump at Davos. But famously, Carney's got elected essentially because of a response by Canadians to American trade policy. Carney was a huge underdog until Trump came in and threatened Canada, and that led to a rally around Carney and kind of a big campaign upset. Is there any sense that the negotiations around Mercosur in the EU are being that directly affected by the U.S. policy? No.
No, you see, the agriculture side of things is quite sensitive. So
I understand. I'm disappointed to hear that as an American. I kind of want to insert us into every story and assume that we matter.
yeah, we're going to be allowing a load of beef into the EU.
Right.
Poultry, beef, ethanol, rice, corn. And that's threatening farmers here, and it's got their hackles up. At one stage, French farmers drove to Brussels, to the European Parliament, and sprayed the building with slurry.
Oh,
You know what the slurry is? So they sprayed the building with their cow manure, essentially,
right.
all over the EU Parliament. And the French know how to, the French guys know how, the French farmers know how to protest. But the French are probably world leaders in protesting. They really do know how to protest, in fairness.
Evidently.
So,
I mean, that's a nice combination of just creativity and horror.
yeah, France, Ireland, and Portugal again. They're afraid of the market being flooded with, duty-free quotas on beef and poultry, sugar, and leading to losses and farm closures. But the reality of the situation is that Irish farmers in particular, if we left the EU in the morning, the industry would collapse without the EU. So they just don't want the competition, and that there are genuine concerns about the standard of beef and poultry being exported from those countries. It's a serious issue. I mean, we don't allow American poultry or beef to be imported anywhere in the EU.
I know, because it's because you hate our freedom
and stuff. Yes, we hate your freedom-loving chickens and dead cows. So, I mean, some of the stuff the United States injects into its beef has been shown to cause cancer. It's an awful lot of chlorine in the chicken. And we don't know why you do this. It's to make it look bigger, maybe. We feel that the United States agriculture industry, particularly around livestock, is so substandard that we can't have it in the EU. So
yeah, it's really a stunning thing to hear as an American, when the entire European Union, with very minimal opposition, is going, "Hey, you guys know all the stuff you eat? Yeah, don't let it anywhere here. We do not want it crossing our border. We don't want your food anywhere near us. Go away. We don't care." There's a good Twitter thread by a guy named, I'm probably butchering the pronunciation, Directinus, based out of Romania. The U.S. Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent at Davos, was making some joke on some right-wing U.S. cable network, and he said he'd rather eat bugs than Swiss food. And so this Twitter thread was in response to that. But the one that was kind of funny to me, American instant mashed potatoes are banned. And Europeans may not know what American instant mashed potatoes look like. It's just basically a bag of these little
powder
flakes
of some sort, is it?
Yeah, they're just little flakes that you pour water in, and it is kind of concerning that it's kind of like a kid's toy. Like, kids can make slime now and stuff like that. There is that feel to it. You just pour water in and microwave it, and all of a sudden it's potatoes. It is concerning. Yeah, the U.S. chicken is banned because, as you said, it's bathed in chlorine, which, I don't know, it seems fine. It's in pools. It's in swimming pools. So,
and in an article that struck me, I mean, they claimed their beef was weak. US officials claimed European and Irish beef is weak, apparently, because we don't allow American beef into the country. So it's
your cows are weaker because they're not pumped full of steroids.
Well, that's it. Growth hormones.
Right.
We've had a ban on them since 1989. So this is not a recent thing. Okay, this is not in reaction to Trump or Bassett or whoever else.
We'll post a link to that thread. It's fun. But yeah, you guys don't take our apples. You don't take our Fruit Loops, which is a cereal. Yeah. And if you haven't seen Fruit Loops, I would Google it to see. You will see colors that literally do not appear in nature. They are, I don't know what fruit they're supposed to represent, but they are not natural colors. You can see it on the box. Yeah. And of course, our milk as well. We can't export milk to the EU.
Now, there's an environmental issue in regards to Mercosur as well that people might not be aware of it. So they're slashing and burning the Amazon by about 5% annually for farmland. And people are claiming that this deal will probably exacerbate the issue and make even less Amazon rainforest there for us all. So Brazil also uses a very heavy pesticide use. So I think what's going to happen here is that they will start spot checking what's coming into the country, and if there's any kind of contaminated meat with chlorine or heavy pesticide traces are found in the food chain, they will use that as a stick to try and ban the beef and poultry issues. On the flip side of that is Paraguay is having trouble getting it through its own parliament at the moment. So the EU is not the only stumbling block here. So
Right.
it's remains to be seen where it gets over, if it gets over the line in South America also.
Yeah. I mean, as you said up front, there's a reason these things take years. It's not necessarily because politicians are idiots. I mean, these are massively, massively complex deals. There's so many potential loopholes and there's just so many concerns.
And look, I think it kind of shows that the EU and South America are trying to come to some sort of agreement on a rules-based order.
Right.
In light of kind of pressure from the United States and stuff like that.
When we have these trade debates in America, manufacturing jobs seem to play an outsized role. About 8% of American non-agriculture employees work in manufacturing now, yet the impact on manufacturing often is at the center of the debate. Is the same sense playing out here in the EU and in Ireland in particular with farmers, that even though they're kind of a small percentage of the population, the effect on them is really taking maybe not quite center stage, but being centered in these arguments?
Yeah, I mean, like farmers in Ireland, there's about 160, 150, 160,000 people directly or indirectly employed in farming in Ireland. It's we export the vast quantity of it to the EU. We export it to 175 countries globally, I think, or 180 countries globally. And they're very vocal. They're really good at lobbying. They scare politicians. So farming plays an outsized role in the Irish imagination, because we were largely a very agricultural country up to a very long time, for up to very recently, up to the 80s.
Right.
And I mean, if you ask farmers, they see themselves as vital to the economy, and they are. They are. I mean, who's going to feed us if there's no farms?
You hear exactly that question asked in pubs in places like North Dakota and downstate Illinois and things like that. I've heard that point made quite a few times here as well.
There was a recent survey showed that the farming community is widely supported within Ireland, and they're seen as essential to our society. So,
right. There's a little bit of a cultural, historic reason for that too. You're saying that they're a link to a maybe a simpler, if not purely happier time.
A lot of people emigrated from farms in Ireland,
right?
So there is a cultural sentimentality when it comes to farming in Ireland. So,
right,
and ultimately they don't want to share their markets with parvenus from South America, I suppose, for want of a better word. It's a matter of protecting their livelihood. So,
for sure.
And in saying that, a lot of farms in Ireland are generally small holders. They're not massive farmers. They're not, these big, huge hundreds of acres that you might see in Dakota or Illinois, right, or Wyoming or something like that. They're small family farms that have been passed down through the generations for the last 1,000 years.
Yeah, we have lost many of those. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it's hard to get into past the psyche of what Irish farming means culturally to Ireland. So, and they're going to step up there. They're going to really step up their lobbying now, I think. Because their market is under threat and their livelihoods are under threat. And I have a bit of sympathy for that, but ultimately, Mercosur is going to be far better in the long term overall for both parts of the world.
Right.
And they're going to have to probably get on board.
Yeah, I mean, that's the way that these agreements go, and I think it's part of why they are so charged politically. You could probably, in the U.S., substitute manufacturing jobs for what you're saying about farmers. Right. Manufacturing is part of our history, and I think a little bit part of our psyche, right? That we built these great things, and we tell ourselves that we built the bombs that won World War II and built the battleships and all that stuff. And I think the average American doesn't want to let that go or to see that shrink. There are some more logical reasons as well. One of the points I think that Trump and his supporters have made about manufacturing is around areas like defense or in tech, that we need to have the capability to build computer chips here. If all our chips are built in Taiwan or in China, that's obviously a problem. But yeah, there's definitely a cultural thing, and Americans generally have that idea that manufacturing jobs should be protected because they're honorable, even though the people who actually work those jobs, particularly in the past, were doing so that their children didn't have to, be 58 years old and
breaking their back.
I think that same point with our move to free trade pre-Trump is that overall, I do think that these deals are mostly beneficial, but they do have very, very real costs for a small part of the population. I think that's just the nature of what free trade is. Whoever was getting protected is no longer getting protected. That that really hurts that industry, even if everyone else, generally has more selection, lower prices, things like that.
The MEPs voting to send it to the European Court of Justice kind of really misjudges the world mood as well, because we need to decouple from America, and we're not going to do that by putting up barriers to trade on our side of the fence either, So
Right.
And what was telling as well about the vote in the EU Parliament to send it to European Courts of Justice was that it had support across the board: far left, far right, centrist,
Right.
centre left, centre right. It wasn't just a handful of disaffected MEPs held it up. I mean, they had support all over.
The bill gets support from across the political spectrum, but also opposition from across the political spectrum,
yes,
too,
yeah.
right? Yeah, this is not typically a left-right issue, and that's been the same in the U.S. When NAFTA was approved in the House of Representatives, it was kind of a similar vote to what you're saying. It was 234 to 200, so pretty close, but it was the same deal. It was not Democrats on one side, Republicans on the other. It was people within each party were being for or against. And even with our current trade policy, obviously Trump pushing it from the right, but that same protectionist impulse, that same pro-manufacturing jobs protectionist push has been made by people on the left. Bernie Sanders is not terribly upset with using tariffs to protect American manufacturing jobs or American farmers as he sees it.
Yeah, what you saw here with governments coming out against it across Europe and France and Poland and other countries was that they were protecting their flanks. Other politicians were using it as an excuse to beat the governments over the head with. So they were saying, the government is pro-selling out farmers and EU puppets and all this kind of stuff. So they were trying to hold off accusations of being, EU puppets or trying to kill the farming industry. So it's hardened views across Europe, and now the deal might go through. I have my suspicions that there'll be some rolling back in it somewhat in the next couple of months. I think as a couple of elections kicking off in Europe, and I think governments are going to be forced to come out against it.
Yeah, I mean, again, if you think that the idea of free trade, which I do, is that it kind of helps most people a little and it hurts a few people a lot, that really makes it such a useful political issue, because one guy's up there going, you're selling out our farmers, you're putting our food quality at risk. And the other guy's going, look, you can get a steak for 35 cents cheaper. Because the benefits are pretty diffuse and I think not that easy to quantify or for the average person to see, I think it's telling that the world did move towards free trade for so many decades. It really tells you how powerful that neoliberal mindset was and how much people were on board with globalization at the time, because purely from a political standpoint, it's much easier to be on the anti-free trade side. It's just an easier thing to make slogans and commercials and speeches about.
Yeah, well, there's a backlash globally against globalization, isn't there?
Right. Oh, for sure. Yeah.
For decades, we've had the neoliberal world order, and there's been a backlash against neoliberalism and globalization across the world in the last couple of years. The so-called trickle-down economics of neoliberalism hasn't worked for vast numbers of people across the globe.
Yeah, I think that's true. Obviously, we've seen the backlash here, and there's a little bit of a chicken and the egg thing with Trump. Was Trump elected in part because that sentiment changed, or has that sentiment changed because he's been talking about us getting ripped off for basically 10 years now? There are images that we have in America. We have these Rust Belt cities of, that really are almost physical representations of the anti-free trade argument and of, let's be honest, in part, the fact that there is no free lunch. These things do have downsides, and places like Youngstown, Ohio, and Gary, Indiana is one of the famous ones. It's just south of Chicago. It's a former steel town, and it's almost physically a husk.
How big is that town?
Youngstown now has 60,000 people. At its peak, it had 170,000.
Well,
I mean, for an American city to lose almost 2/3 of its population is almost unthinkable. The trend for Gary is relatively similar. Now, again, that doesn't mean that free trade did that. I think the story that, we just shipped our jobs to China is far too simplistic. But to my point earlier, it's a very easy story to tell, isn't it?
Well, yeah, it is an easy story to tell. And, people will tell you that free trade will lead to stronger interdependence and peace between countries. There's a peace dividend to be had from free trade, okay? And that's what's been happening for the last 30 years until Trump's come in now and decided to take a wrecking ball to it. With free trade going out the window and tariffs coming in, that peace dividend is over now. It's troubling, it's worrying, because Trump's view of the world when it comes to trade is at odds with the rest of the global economy. And with the tariffs, the peace dividend goes out the window. So the world is no longer a free trade haven. And with the trade going out the window, there's no mutual interdependence. And it's shaking the world order, as everybody's seen. But, Trump is the only person that thinks this, and the people around him are the only people that think this as well. So they're ending the liberal world order when it comes to trade, and that's why the economy, I think, is eventually going to tank if Trump does any more damage to it.
We keep coming back to that phrase, the liberal world order, huh? There's an interesting counterpoint there, because what you're talking about with this idea of there being a peace dividend kind of through trade and interdependence, and there is one historical lesson that might dispute your point a little bit, which is the entrance of China into the World Trade Organization. Like as said, that happened in 1999. That was part of Clinton's administration for years and years. As I said up front, took about 15 years. And there is an interesting economic paper from a couple of years later that kind of talked about the optimists and the pessimists. In addition, the optimists say China's entry will promote the rule of law in the country, undercut the power of the state to control the lives of its citizens, and accelerate China's transition from a command economy to a market economy. And I think that's something that a lot of people right now would say that the optimists were wrong and the pessimists were right. And one of the pessimists said right at the time, it was signed, that basically that this was a disaster. One of the points that he made in an op-ed in the New York Times was that allowing China in the WTO would remove America's ability to put on tariffs over things like oppressing its citizens. And the gentleman who wrote that New York Times op-ed was Robert Lighthizer, who wound up being the trade representative in Trump's first term, very influential in terms of the tariffs that were put on. And I think about how Trump thought about them. China, I think, is a really interesting example in this debate of the pros and cons. I think optimists would say 25 years later, perhaps it hasn't worked quite as well as we thought, but we have moved China to a market economy. We have opened up some ideas. There has been incremental progress, while a pessimist, particularly an American pessimist, would say, China's just used this agreement to run over the West and perhaps run over the world, depending on how you view things like Belt and Road and all that.
I think the quote from, was it Clinton at the time or Bush? I can't remember who it was. Something about if we sell them McDonald's or footballs, they'll become a liberal democracy. I think it was something along those lines.
Right.
And it hasn't turned out to be the case. And even with the tariffs slapped on China at the moment, their economy is still surging ahead of everybody else's.
Yeah, I mean, they say their economy is surging ahead of everybody else. That's been a debate for about 20 years, what their numbers are.
Yes,
what they
can we
mean,
trust their data?
25 years later, ironically, I do think that debate still holds, of not necessarily whether China's entry into the WTO is a good thing, but just China's role in the world order. To what extent is that a good thing or a bad thing? It's obviously, China is a huge issue here. It's been a big part of Trump's campaign. It's a big reason why he garnered support. There is a story that some Americans tell that basically we gave our country away to China. We let them in the WTO. All our corporations, led by these rich fat cats, moved all their factories to China to save money. And it destroyed our manufacturing base. It destroyed Youngstown. It destroyed Gary. And if you say to those people, well, look, free trade, it means cheaper goods, it means things like that, their answers be, yeah, well, we get cheaper goods, but it's all junk because it's made in China and the stuff that we made in America was much better. And they will just say basically that this has been an unalloyed negative. And I'm curious, is there a strain of thought in Europe that is similarly negative towards China? That they're basically an economic enemy?
There is, especially when it comes to Chinese EVs, electric vehicles.
Right, of course, yeah.
Like German car production has collapsed. There was some data out during the week that showed that, it's down by up to 70% in some places. And it's Chinese EVs flooding the EU market has caused this. So that's why Germany wants Mercosur to go ahead so we can sell more cars into another market.
Right.
Like Chinese overcapacity is a massive issue. And, there's the human rights, as you alluded to there, that we let them into the WTO, we sell them McDonald's, we sell them soccer balls. and they'll improve their human rights record. And if anything at all, their human rights records got worse.
That aspect of the case for allowing them into the WTO hasn't worked. Now, you could say that the counterfactual, we don't let them in, probably doesn't mean that it does work. Whether dangling the carrot of WTO membership for another 25 years would have done more to open up their economy and improve their human rights is probably a tough question. I mean, that point you bring up about Germany, there's a little financial note worth making, which is that Volkswagen, off and on for years now, its stock has actually traded at less than the value of the cash and assets that it has. Basically, the equity market has on numerous occasions over the last few years argued that the value of Volkswagen's operating business is negative, because basically the argument is that the competition from China is so steep that it's essentially going to put them out of business, and that they will actually lose money before they figure that out. Give you a sense of the fact that global investors are pretty worried about that EV issue as well.
Yeah, you walk around the streets of Dublin or anywhere in Ireland and EU, and you see these BYD cars, Build Your Dream cars, electric cars. Leap Motor is another company.
Right.
Every second house in Ireland has a Chinese-made EV at this stage.
Yeah, and they've taken a couple European nameplates, haven't they? Like, aren't there a couple?
They took MG, yes, the famous British MG.
Right. Yeah.
They bought that nameplate. I think, what did they buy it for? Like €4 million or dollars or something?
It could be, yeah. I mean, if anyone in America knows an MG, it's basically like my mom still speaks fondly about some MG convertible she had in 1969. And it's one of those funny, like, boomer stories. She's like, oh, it's such a great car. Yeah, the gas tank was right under the driver's seat.
Yeah, so when they crashed, you were dead.
Okay, that's great, Mom. I don't want to hear any more complaining about how there's too many regulations nowadays, because you guys had some things to fix, let's be honest.
Yeah, so it was a British car, very British brand, and the Chinese bought the brand, and their cars are all over Ireland now at the moment. The MG brand is all over Ireland. So
right.
And there's other issues with China and the EU as well. I mean, numerous spying allegations, undue influence on our universities. Chinese EU societies and different universities have been accused of spying.
Wow.
TikTok is ultimately owned by the Chinese army. You do nothing without the Chinese army say so, who are ultimately in charge of the ruling party, the Communist Party in China. They're nominally communist anyway. I don't think so anymore. But and TikTok has been accused of, it's all kinds of things, spying on kids, massive amounts of disinformation coming from TikTok, huge amounts of disinformation coming from TikTok. And up to 95% of their traffic on TikTok is bots, and it's not something that's been spoken about quite openly. So any study showed anywhere between 75% and 95% of all traffic on TikToks are bots.
That's wild.
AI-generated bots. It's a massive source of disinformation. It's poisoning kids' brains. And did you know TikTok? They don't have TikTok in China. They banned it.
Yeah, we hear that because that's been a long-running debate. It's been in political football. Congress passed a law basically saying they were going to shut it down in the U.S. And Trump basically hadn't done anything for months until recently. They finally just cut a deal to create a U.S. version. But yeah, we hear that point constantly, that if this is really a worthwhile thing, why the heck don't they have it in the place where they developed it? Yeah.
Yeah, turn our kids' minds into slush. So
yeah, we don't need any help doing that. We have our own apps that can turn our kids' minds into slush. We don't need China making it worse.
Making it worse, yeah. So we've put tariffs on EV vehicles, but it hasn't stymied the flow of EV vehicles into Europe, because essentially the Chinese government heavily subsidized their manufacturing also.
Right.
So, and that's the problem. In the EU, we're not allowed to subsidize. I don't think it's the same in the United States. We're not allowed to subsidize individual companies. So the only thing we subsidize in the EU is actually our agriculture.
Right.
That's why we're back to Mercosur here again, that farming plays such an outsized part in the European imagination, the European mind, and particularly Ireland and France and Poland, Slovenia, Greece, Romania. They were all very, very, very dead set against Mercosur.
Yeah, we have massive, massive agricultural subsidies here as well. Again, politically, the guy goes up and says, I'm giving money to farmers. It's a good political stance to take. It's hard to push back on that too much. That one of the problems we have is that our subsidies, unfortunately, wind up skewing our food, because corn is subsidized in a way that sugar isn't. So it makes corn more profitable to grow, which is why we have corn syrup and everything.
Ethanol subsidies.
Yeah, I mean, ethanol subsidies are a pretty bitter debate, but not only is that about farmers, but that's about Iowa farmers. And given that the Iowa caucuses are such a huge part of the early going of the presidential election, nobody wants to piss off Iowa farmers because it means that your presidential ambitions are literally over. If you're a senator who votes against, a soybean subsidy or whatever, they are not going to forget 12 years from now.
It's the same in Ireland. Farming is the same in Ireland. It has the same hold on the political mind and the general population also. And that's why it's very hard to do anything against their interests, ultimately.
Right.
Their lobby is incredibly strong, highly effective, highly newsworthy all the time because, they have a tendency to jump in their tractors and shut down cities. That they're very effective tactics. And it's the same all over the world.
Yeah, the history of free trade in the U.S. in my lifetime, I think even with the political importance of farmers and manufacturing jobs, has been in the direction of free trade. It's always been an issue. Obviously, as we said, it was a huge issue in 92 and throughout Clinton's presidency. Obama got in a huge amount of trouble because he famously said that those jobs aren't coming back, referring to manufacturing jobs. And he was referring more specifically to the impact of automation, but that became a shorthand for his view in general. And something that Clinton shared as well, that we're not fixing manufacturing jobs. We need to retrain them for better jobs. And obviously Trump has represented a pretty huge rupture there. Has there been anything similar in Europe? I mean, you have mentioned like a backlash towards free trade. Has that built over the last 10 years? Is there the same sense that a lot of people have here that globalization has benefited only a few and failed the majority?
Yes. I mean, you can see that across the EU with the rise of not necessarily far-right parties, although they are on the rise, but they're more populist parties. Okay,
right.
So they're more nativist in their outlook as opposed to looking to the EU
right
for guidance or inspiration. In Ireland, we have a political party called Independent Ireland, who are quite populist, quite nativist, generally anti-EU and very right-wing, I suppose, when it comes to societal issues and farming, and they're quite protectionist.
Okay.
So there is a backlash, and they are growing as a movement in Ireland at the moment. So, and you can see Viktor Orban, Hungary, Italy, take your pick of parties across Greece, and these are not necessarily left-wing, far-left parties or far-right parties or centre-left or centre-right parties. They're nativists, is what I would call them. They're inward-looking, not outward-looking.
They can be inward-looking in very, very different ways, right? Yes. It's the horseshoe theory that everyone's talking about. There's echoes of that in America. Again, Trump and Bernie Sanders share quite a bit of common ground on trade. I'm going to wrap this up with one last question as we've, used Mercosur to kind of bounce into broader world issues. It seems to me that this is one of the last really big deals left to do. Obviously you said U.S. trade policy is so volatile that no one's going to be rushing to make a comprehensive deal with the U.S. China has its own issues. Outside of India, this is two of the biggest blocs that can do a deal. So if this doesn't happen, do you see that as kind of like an inflection point for that multi-decade push towards free trade and interdependence, or is this just a one-off with its own idiosyncrasies?
So Mercosur is on the knife edge at the moment. If the European Courts of Justice shoot it down, it's going to fail. It's going to be a geopolitical setback for the EU. Its foreign policy will be cut adrift. But at least, farmers are going to be spared the increased competition, so they'll be happy. And that's where we are at the moment.
I mean, I guess the question is, if it fails, what's next for the EU from a very broad standpoint? Are there other trade deals to be done? I mean, is that a death knell for the strategy of decoupling from the U.S. and of pushing for new power bases and new counterweights?
Well, what would happen there in that instance is that I'd imagine they'll have to do unilateral deals with each independent South American country.
Okay, so that will take 25 years a deal.
Yeah, so that could be another.
I'm sure that will go well. It took 25 years to negotiate with all of them. I'm sure individually
they'll be fine. Yeah, so that's where we are. We are where we are. The famous saying from Brian Cohn. It does highlight the fragility of current trade agreements, I think. It's a blow for multilateral institutions, and the EU being a multilateral institution would be severely harmed if it doesn't go through.
I think multilateral institutions have had enough blows over the last 10 years, so it does seem like
and they're not done yet.
Yeah.
They're not done yet.
We did wander, and that was kind of the point. We wanted to focus on this deal and talk about trade and globalization more broadly, because it's so obviously driving politics in so many countries across the world right now, and it's going to have real world effects. So it'll be really interesting to see how this plays out. We will be back on Friday with a news wrap up. I'm sure it will be another quiet week in politics and geopolitics. And until then, we hope you all stay safe. Stay healthy.
Thank you for listening.
Yep. Thank you for listening. This has been the Atlantic Current. Bye now.
Bye-bye.